And welcome to this video podcast. How important is the equine industry, the horse industry, the donkey industry in today's world in the 21st century? Because if you think a couple hundred years ago, and then the preceding 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years, domesticated horses 5,500 years ago, but really when horses made big impacts on society around the world, especially in Asia, Africa, Europe, a couple hundred years ago, they were it. They were your car. They were your transportation. They pulled your wagons. They transported goods to town and through cities and across continents. So horses obviously have made a massive impact on human society these last few thousand years. Changed our history completely. But today, do we need horses? Are they important? You know, how critical are they? So that is really the topic of today is where we are in the 21st century with our horse industry and then where we're going in the future because it is still changing. And I will tell you, horses are still a critical part of many cultures around the world as far as their transportation. Whether they live in very mountainous regions, there are certain countries that don't have as many roads, or it's just still part of their culture where horses are an integral part of day to day life, like they were for many of us in the Western world, or, you know, Australia, New Zealand, United States, Canada, all throughout South America, going over to Europe, many of the developed nations where horses are no longer needed, where we have automobiles or we have, motorcycles or other vehicles that can get over rough terrain. But horses still are working throughout the world in many, many societies. So we're going to talk about that. And then in this Western culture, or it's not even Western culture, I mean, Eastern culture, parts of Asia, horses are a massive part of their day to day life in the sense of companionship, right? So when we look at Europe and the United States, Canada, parts of South America, again, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, horses are companion animals in parts of Thailand and India and all these other countries. So kind of giving a spotlight today on where we are in the equine industry and how important it is to the world's economy. Because in today's world, in the 21st century, we still value things based on what they're worth, what's the monetary value of things. That's what we still place importance on. And if we look globally at the horse industry, and I'm going to get a little bit more into this and do some comparisons, but over 300 billion USD, I'm going to talk in United States dollars, 300 billion of the horse industry contribution to their economic impact. So what does that mean? And why care, right? Why is that important? So get ready. Going to be fun, kind of a spotlight. And then we'll kind of look at what people are doing with their horses. Look at some of these surveys that have been done, these economic surveys, and, are people showing? Are they, racing or just recreation riding? So I have some of those statistics I'm going to share with you today too. So really, really fun. But again, when we look over, so taking that historical context, the last few thousand years, we know how horses and donkeys, because they're part of this discussion too, had such a big part in changing our history. But that all changed 100 years ago. Really, it was pre-World War One. So you're looking in the early 1900s, early 20th century. Horses were still a big part of day-to-day life with transportation in cities and out in the rural areas. So in the historical context, horses obviously were huge to us. We've talked about that. But it really changed 100 years ago in the early 1900s, where horses in 1910, 1920, Getting to 1930, they were still big parts of everyday daily life in big cities, in the rural areas, where if you wanted to go to town, you had to get in your cart or you had to get on back of your horse. Then, with the automobile becoming more available with Henry Ford, he was big in the Model T with these assembly lines where they could make these vehicles quickly, and then tractors. And then that technology spread around the planet. And again, this is all happening in the early 20th century. People didn't need horses. So we saw horses population spike and then crash. And not until the 1960s and 70s in developed nations like the United States, Canada, Europe, and elsewhere did we see horses come back as recreation animals, where we are today in the 2020s. So that, 100 years ago, horses were critical. They were absolutely vital. In 1900, you go around the planet, you needed horses, period. If, for a quality of life that people were living then. Whereas today, that still holds true in many countries, but in more developed nations, we have electric vehicles now. And we have airplanes, and we're moving on trains, and we have motor vehicles. So that has diminished the importance of horses as far as day-to-day life. But when we say 300 billion economic impact, that is very, very big. And I guess I should have opened up with this. I understand the horses are super important to you in your life because you're watching this and you're interested in it. They've had a big key part in my life, and I love them. They're important to me. They're super important to me. But what about, the people around me that didn't grow up with horses or didn't grow up learning about horses? They don't care as much, but it still impacts them because the community I live in, which is a little bit rural, farming community, and there's many, many horses around me. Those horse owners and all the things would help my city where I live in. The economics of where I'm living is directly impacted by horse owners. And that holds true for many, many parts of the world. Okay, so thinking about this, I thought it would be good to revisit where all the horses in the world are. And then we're going to talk about what they could possibly do in those societies. So when we do a global view, there's about 60 million horses around the planet. There's about 40 million donkeys, because we haven't talked a lot about donkeys, and they're just right next to them. And donkeys they are companion animals for many people, but they are still doing a lot of work in a lot of areas in the world, especially where we have high donkey populations. South America, Asia, those donkeys are working animals. Africa, where they still depend on them to do labor for their owners. So they're a big part of the world still. So there's over 100 million horses. They're on every continent except Antarctica. They're on tropical islands. Wherever you go in the world, there are horses and there are donkeys. And then we have our mules and all the other hybrids. Now, when we break that down, we'll start with Africa. 7.3 million horses. This is according to data of the UN in 2020. 7.3 million horses on the continent of Africa. So think about the importance there to the peoples there, to the many, many countries across Africa. So if we go to South Africa, the country of South Africa, there is polo. There's a lot of recreation sports. There are people that own horses for doing some work. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about this later too. Horses that are patrolling on anti-poaching teams, in these national parks in the country of South Africa. You go up to Central Africa, you have horses that are still working out there. There are horses that are in tourism. I've seen in parts of Africa where you can ride a horse on the beach. That is going on there. And then when I visited Cairo close to 14 years ago to give a talk at a conference, and the horses are super important to the peoples there too. where not only are they working, I saw quite a bit of working horses pulling carts and, taking vegetables and fruits to the markets, things like that. But then you have some really good bloodlines of some of these Arab horses, other types of breeds in Egypt, where, people own some really top sires and mares, and they're important to them, and across North Africa. So 7.3 million horses there. Then we go to Asia, and there's only 14.1 million. Now, I say only because Asia is massive and you have billions of people living there. India, over a billion people. China, over a billion people. So, where do horses fit in there? But let's talk Japan and then move west. In Japan, horses were very, very big part of their culture in their history, the last few thousand years. But now Japan has some top thoroughbreds. They have some top bloodlines there for recreation. And wherever we go in the world, there's going to be horses doing some sort of work. So whether it's police work or some of the other things I'm going to talk about. But in Japan, horses are still, big, and they have some really incredible bloodlines. Then if we go over into, say, China, horses not so much compared to, say, donkeys. Very, very large population of donkeys there. Working animals, again, you do have recreation there too. And then I get into, Mongolia, obviously. It's a horse country. I mean, they horse crazy in Mongolia, and some of the most incredible horses in the cradle of where some of these horses' early days were domesticated. I mean, Eurasia, we're looking at Kazakhstan and Ukraine, but whenever you think of Mongolia, you think of horses. And Przewalski's horse, or Przewalski's horse, that wild one, has been reintroduced there. So very, very important to them. Then as you go, like I said, Kazakhstan, I just think of the Akhal-Teke, that gorgeous shiny coat. Very, very big part of their culture still. Then you go south, India. I mean, polo, recreation, working animals. And then across from Thailand, we just talked about that the other week when we were talking about diseases and African horse sickness. Then if I go all the way west to, Southwest Asia, or what some of us call the Middle East, you have some incredible bloodlines there in Dubai and Saudi Arabia, where they love horses, obviously. And then you had, the original Arabian and all these other types of horses emerge from that area. So horses are still a big part in Asia. Then Europe, over 5 million. I'm going to break this down a little bit more later, where they are. You have a large population in Romania, still very much working, pulling carts, very, very important to those peoples there. But then I go Germany, Netherlands, France, and then obviously the UK, Finland, Sweden, Switzerland. They have some incredible breeds. And then you go down to the Iberian Peninsula. So many of our incredible, hot-blooded, warm-blooded horses that impacted the Americas came out of Spain, Portugal, and then Italy, and then other parts of Europe. So horses are very important there, but of that 5 million, probably mainly recreation. We'll break that down a little bit. This one always surprised me when I look at Latin America and the Caribbean. So I believe this includes Mexico, even though Mexico should be considered North America as a continent. But Mexico has a massive horse population, very much part of their culture there, some incredible bloodlines there. You think of the vaquero, the Mexican cowboy, the racing industry, they have all sorts. And then they have working animals too. You still see them working out in the fields. Donkeys are important there too, but very, very much part of Latin American culture, then all the way down to Panama, going through all Central America. And then the Caribbean islands, where people still have horses for recreation, racing, and some other things going on there. So huge amount of horses there. Then obviously North America, 10.9 million. Canada, the United States, we're going to break that down more detail. Huge economic drivers there, which we'll explain. Oceania, 450,000. So talking about, all the islands, and I think Australia is in there too, and New Zealand here. And then South America, 13 million horses. and very much working horses, but polo in parts of Argentina and Chile. And then you have incredible recreation riders. You get a lot of these gaited horses, the Pasafinos, and all of that coming out. Brazil, huge horse country. They love their horses, and a lot of them are working. A lot of working horses there too. So that gives you a snapshot. So when you look at where the horses are, and then you really think, okay, how important are they? They're huge. They're huge to these cultures around the world. So even though we don't really depend on them for most of us to get us to point A to point B, a lot of cultures still do, but they're still playing a big key role in the world. Then when you think about it, okay, you have the animal, then you have the owner, and so you need someone to take care of these horses. You need feed for them, right? You need hay and other types of feed, the supplements and uh, other things to feed them. They need medical and dental care wherever they're at. Farrier, you absolutely need farrier care. And, whether they're working animals or recreation. So that means you get a lot of jobs, a lot of things that drive economies. Like I said, where I live, uh, horses are a key piece of keeping people in business. So, what's some of the jobs that they might be doing? So, we can look at recreation, and we've talked many podcasts on that, all the different equestrian sports. But what kind of jobs? So, horses are used in police work. Many years ago, when I was training horses, I worked with the Houston Police Department at Texas A&M. We were training them on and with the cavalry horses that we were working with too, because for parades and things, you need these horses to be really calm and really desensitized to loud noises, stuff like that. So police work, you still see horses throughout the world being used. Ranch work, still people on the back of horses riding, you know, roping cattle, doing all the things that they do in South America, in Asia, in Australia, and of course in the Americas, Canada, United States, Mexico. So that is still a big piece of cattle management. Logging. Mules do this too, and maybe donkeys and small logging, but eh, horses, draft horses, mules, they still are used in logging operations because they can get to areas that, say, maybe a big tractor or something couldn't get to. So they are still quite used around the world for that. Um, People still use them to plow fields. Like I said, in Romania and other parts of the world, they still are a big part of helping farmers farm, where they don't have big tractors or they can't afford a big tractor, but they can afford a draft horse or two, to help plow fields and plant and grow food for their families, and that's their business. We see tourism and carriage rides, like I talked about, in Africa, in Vanuatu, where I went a few months back. There, we went on a horseback ride, and the horses were well kept, well taken care of, gorgeous body condition. They were doing really, really well. And that helps the local economy, going out and riding a horse through the natural forests, along the beaches. That is huge around the world. I talked about, like, South Africa, mounted patrols and wildlife conservation, which one of my friends who started a foundation a few years ago, he has now helped develop mounted patrols in some of these areas in Africa where poaching was high for elephants and white rhinos, where now he has mounted patrols, and they have trained the rangers there how to take care of their horses, and they use them to get around. Therapy and rehabilitation, I'm going to talk about this later because, again, it's something I just love. I love that horses do that because I love my connection to the animals, and bringing that to somebody else and watching their faces light up and how exhilarating it is. And therapy, we'll talk about that more in more detail. Search and rescue operations, again, horses can get to areas where mounted patrols couldn't, or where, like, vehicles couldn't. And culture, I mean, it's still huge, still big. Then most of what our horses are today is we do have working horses, but then we have recreation. That's where a lot of our horses, where I live, that's what they do, where many of you probably live, is recreation riding for sports, competitions, but leisure, just riding your horse, just going for a hack, or just, just going for a small ride through the forest. It just does something to the soul, right? That's why we do it. And then you have racing. Racing's still a big economic driver around the world. And then one of the other things I really wanted to highlight was youth. All my friends, I always tell them, get your kids involved with horses, keep them out of trouble. It's there's something about children that get involved with these riding clubs, the 4-H activities, pony clubs, wherever you live in the world, where you get the youth involved. And many young girls want to get into horses, but many young men too. And I would encourage it, because they fall in love with these animals, and then they ride, and then they develop their skills and do it in a safe manner. It's something that has really changed a lot of students' lives. And I see them coming through. That's why when I was teaching at the university level, a lot of these students coming through that grew up with horses, and they just, I don't know, they were just more responsible. They were hardworking. Maybe that's just my bias. I don't know. But they just seemed well-rounded students, and they loved their horses. They were horse mad, right? So definitely something I would say it is important. The equine industry is very critical in the development of our youth throughout the world. Okay. So let's get to the economic impact, because that's what people outside our industry care about. Well, okay, why do you matter then? Okay, your horses, da da da. We say, actually, if it wasn't for the horse industry, this area would not be as built up. I mean, we have big farm shops and tack shops where I live. You go down, you see some beautiful farms, the fencing, the signage, all these things that are indirectly being supported through the horse industry on top of the direct. And I'll break down some of the direct. I mean, you're talking feed. Go to a hay dealer, I pay him money to buy feed for my animals. That's a direct expenditure. But the indirect is the truck driver that had to haul the hay to his feed store and everything that comes with that. So not only paying for the truck services, but that truck needs to be serviced. I mean, fuel in today's world, we want to get to more electric and more sustainable. But think about all these little branches that are infected by me buying hay at my local feed dealer. There's many, and that's just hay. Then I got to go and get my supplements, and then I've got to go and get my equipment sometimes. So there's all these indirect and direct. And that's the economic impact that an industry has. Okay, so that's how they look at these numbers. That's what our politicians care about, our economists care about, is what's the economic impact? And if that industry went away, what would be the impact on the country as a whole, but the town? Like if you took away all the horses that lived within 20-kilometer radius or 20-mile or 10-mile radius of where I live, some of these businesses would shut down, because all of that economic impact. So that's why the world is centered on the economy's money. That's what we place a lot of worth on, and the government does listen. So that is why it's important that we know that the industry matters, that okay, we do have some power to influence policy and some changes. Okay. So like I said, 300 billion, and that's low, I think. I think the horse industry as a whole throughout the world is more than that, but 300 billion. So let's put that into perspective. Travel and tourism is probably the biggest industry in the world that I could find, and it was valued at 9.2 trillion USD. Okay. We're 300 billion. That's just horses, the horse industry. Travel and tourism around the world, 9.2 trillion. Not too far off. The food industry, okay, that's feeding the near 8 billion people on the planet, 5 trillion. So travel and tourism is worth more. Food industry, 5 trillion. Automobiles, 3 trillion USD. Okay. Horse industry is about 10% of that. The automobile, which has replaced the horse, is the horse industry is still 10% of that. So big players. Horse industry is still a massive player in the world's economies. On par with the video gaming industry, which blew my mind. The horse industry is on par with the video gaming industry, which has grown incredibly in the last 20, 30 years, right? With computers, you see it with your children, some of you, me. The video gaming industry is worth about 300 billion in economic impact. The equine industry is worth about 300 billion economic impact around the world. The horse industry is actually worth more than the movie pictures industry. So we have more of an economic impact than movies do. So that was, I think, putting that in a global perspective kind of cool, because you're like, okay, that gives you an idea of how big the horse industry still is. Sure, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, the horse industry was massive. It was critical to human development and our day-to-day lives. But here we are 100 years later, where we don't need horses as much to travel, and it's still a big player because this love we have for them, this companionship we have with them, this recreation and sports that we have with them, which again, I'll break some of this down. So let me look at some individual countries, because that will give you a better idea. Plus, this is where a lot of this data comes from. There is not a world economic report on the equine industry, but there is in individual countries. And some of our best data, again, comes out of the United States. And there is an economic report that I'm going to talk about that comes out every few years. So today, the U.S. horse population is estimated around 7.2 million. Back 10 years ago, it was estimated at 10 million. So I've done some of these reports and worked with people that have done them. We think we're pretty much underreported because people don't trust governments. They don't trust surveys. They're worried they're going to get taxed on how many horses they have. So that's kind of a lower number, but it's 7 to 8 million horses roughly in the United States. Now, from the data, 30% of U.S. households, so the United States has a population of 333 million people, which is a huge country, right? 30% of them. So what is that? Close to 100 million have somebody that's a horse enthusiast that loves horses. Doesn't mean they necessarily own a horse, but they love to go to horse events, competitions. They love riding horses. They care a lot about horses. Still a third, roughly close to a third of the people in the United States. So that's big, big interest there. And 1.3% of the U.S. population owns horses. So that's over 3 million, 3 to 4 million horse owners there. So horse is still very popular in culture. Now, the economic impact in the United States, this just came out, 2023 economic impact study of the U.S. horse industry. The American Horse Council publishes this report every few years. 177 billion direct or indirect and direct impacts to the U.S. economy. So I said the world was 300 billion, the U.S. 177 billion, and this is just came out a few weeks ago, I think, or a few months ago. So I think that 300 billion is a little bit low. It's probably 3 to 400 billion in that range, because this report showed the U.S. impact was 122 billion just 7 years ago. And here we are at $177 billion U.S. horse owners. Some of you watching this have probably contributed to that economic impact. I mean, that's huge. That is a lot of money that horse owners are spending to take care of their animals and compete and show. So horses are still a big part of American society. And I see it here. I see it here in New Zealand. I see it here, over when I go to Australia. Horses everywhere. They love their horses. The UK is massive. They're horse crazy. I'll talk about that one here in a second. Okay, so that was economic impact, and then jobs. We always hear it, especially during election, job creation and all this. The horse industry in the United States employs about 2.2 million jobs. That's directly and indirectly related to the horse industry. Directly meaning they own horses, they train horses, they feed horses, I'll break this down a little bit more in participation. And then indirect, again, that truck driver, that people making feed and doing things that maybe they don't directly, work at a ranch or work at a facility, but their jobs are indirectly related to the horse industry. So 2.2 million out of the 333 million people that live in the United States. Now, when you look at, we're going to break it down a little bit by participation here in a minute. But when you compare that, okay, so that's huge. It's a massive market. The United States is huge. That's why I had a job. That's why I got to get a PhD and study horses for a while and do the things that I did. When you look at other countries, though, it's just as big. So let's go to the north. Let's look at Canada. Population of closely 39 million people live in Canada. 333 million in the US. 39 million in Canada, but horses are still a big part of Canadian life. Over close to 500,000 horses live in Canada, and there's close to 855,000 involved in the equine industry out of 39 million. That's crazy. I mean, it's just like the US, it just directly involved. I mean, these are people directly involved in the industry. So, Equestrian Canada put out a report, and when they looked at their economic impact to the Canadian economy, it was 8.3 billion on just equine keeping, maintaining their horses. So when you look at the numbers and the economic impact, I mean, that is a big part of their economy. So then when you just looked at taxes, close to $900 million Canadian dollars spent in provincial and federal taxes in the horse industry. So that supports their health care, their roads, all the things that Canada provides for their citizens. And just feed alone in Canada, more than $1.1 billion were spent on horse feed. So $1 billion in a country of 39 million. I live in a country now of 5 million. That's massive for us. That's huge if it was New Zealand, but for Canada, 1.1 billion spent on feed. So there is somebody's livelihoods growing hay, making supplements, making other types of horse feeds, 1.1 billion just in Canada. So again, yes, it's huge. It's a big part. The equine industry is a big part of driving economy. So the 8.3 billion on horse keeping or equine keeping, because you got donkeys in there too. When they looked at what horse owners were spending, 13% of their expenditures were on feed. Okay, so that was the biggest. 11% was spent on travel. So that is fuel, the vehicles, trailering costs. Then 10% for equine care products and services. Vet care was roughly 10%. Labor, 8%. Farrier care was 7%. And then it breaks it down. Insurance was like 4% of annual costs. Bedding, 4% of annual costs. So again, when you think of all those tentacles that you spend money on these horses, it is supporting so many other things than just feed or just this or just that. Okay, so that's Canada. If we look at the EU, again, not a huge report, very tough to find this data, but they listed about 111 billion USD is their economic impact. And so the US was upgraded to 177 billion, 8 billion roughly in Canada, and then here's another 111. So we're already at that close to 300 billion. That's why I said we're spending more than what they estimate. So 5 million horses in the EU, employs over 400,000 people, full-time jobs in the equine industry. Now, the UK left the EU with Brexit, but they're huge in the horse industry there. They spend every year roughly 5 billion pounds. So The pound to the dollar, that's 7-8 million USD, or billion, sorry, B with a B, 5 billion pounds is the impact of the horse industry in the UK. And they have at least close to 2 million people riding every week. Over 3 million people ride at least once a year. So horses are still a big part of British society in the UK. Then when you look at where the horses are in the EU or in Europe and then the UK, Romania, close to 450,000 horses. So the reason I bring that up is, again, think about what they're doing in Romania. They're using them to ride. They're using them to pull carts. They're using them to farm. So horses are still a very, very critical part of their day-to-day lives. In the UK, you have close to 425,000 horses. A lot of that's recreation. It's riding, pony clubs, it's racing, it's all of it. I mean, it's just like the United States, Canada, Australia, wherever else you live, spanning the globe. Very, very big part of that is recreation. Germany, 440,000 horses. Again, recreation mainly. I mean, you still have working horses, obviously, but mainly. France at 360,000. Break it down. Italy, Spain, and then the other countries. So horses still a big part of the economies and life in Europe. I mean, still are. Still. Then I just did a quick look at Australia. 5 billion USD in economic impact, which is huge. Australia is only a country of 26 million people. So horses are a big part of Aussie life. 26,000 full-time jobs. And so that just gives you the economic power that the horse industry has. So yes, it's very important to the world and the economies and people's jobs, livelihoods. It's why I do this podcast. It's why Mad Barn does what they do, because it is a big part of the world. And we love these animals. I mean, we love them. We absolutely love them. So very, very, very big economic powerhouse. Then I wanted to kind of look at what people were doing, because you do have a lot of jobs attached to the equine industry. And then, look at owner demographics. So again, I have to go to that report out of the USA. I have a little bit dated data, but it's pretty similar, of that 2023 report coming out of the US. But when you look at the breakdown of what people are doing with their horses in the US, so this report that I had a few years ago was 9 million horses estimate. Racing was 850,000 out of 9 million. Showing was 2.7 million of those horses. So a lot of people were showing, going out competing and things like that. Close to 3.9 million were recreation. So half the horses in the US generally are recreation horses. They put other 1.7 million. That could be somebody that doesn't ride anymore, but they still own horses. They love owning horses. That could be therapeutic riding. That could be the working horses. So the biggest is recreation. I mean, we know that's a lot, but showing's huge. Competing's big. And racing industry, still a powerhouse, still part of you go to Kentucky, you go to Florida, New York, California, Texas, where a lot of these bloodlines in the United States exist for racing, whether it's quarter horse racing or thoroughbreds. So when we looked at jobs, breakdown in the United States. So roughly 2.2 million today is what they estimate of jobs. Racing, in this data I had, was close to 400,000 indirect jobs. The showing industry, close to 400,000 jobs. Recreation, over 400,000 jobs. And then the other category, the working, the carers, things like that. So when you think of 2.2 million jobs in the equine industry, you're thinking of your trainers, your farriers, your veterinarians, your facility managers, your feed shops that are just horse related, your specific horse feed companies. All of that supports 2.2 million jobs just in the US with the equine industry. That's huge. Okay. Then when you look at people that own horses, what they're doing. Breeding, small, 5% of the population. Competing, 10% of the population. Recreation riders was about 24%. Service providers was 3%. So these are people that directly owned horses that weren't doing other things. Then I found this data really interesting. I always found this interesting. The distribution of horse owners by household income. So when you think of a horse owner, and for those that aren't horse owners, if you're a horse owner, you're probably like, I know this. But for those that don't own horses or haven't really worked in the industry, when you think of a horse owner, you usually think, okay, somebody that's wealthy, they can afford it, right? No, in the U.S., and this is again a little dated because I don't have the updated report in my hand, but very similar demographics. Okay, let's say over the 2 million people that own horses, U.S. household income, 11% of horse owners made less than 25,000 USD. Then when you looked at 25,000 to 50,000, that was 23%. Okay, it's not a lot of buying power in that, right? Especially in today's economy in the 2020s. 50,000 to 75,000 was about 22%. Then 75,000 to 100,000, again, this is household income, mom and dad, if they're both working or not. So 75,000 close to 100,000 was 16%. 100,000 to 125,000 was 10%. And then after that, it's 125,000 is the other percentages. But the majority of horse owners, so I'm going to add this up, 45 plus 11. So you're looking at 56% of the owners make less than 75,000 combined income. So it just gives you an idea. Everybody owns horses, and it doesn't matter if you're wealthy or not. So then the other part I found interesting was not only income, but age. So they didn't report under the age of 18, which again, youth, I think is important, but horse people who own horses, horse owners by age 18 to 29, 16%, 30 to 44, 35% of horse owners, 45 to 59 was 41%, and then 60 plus was 6%. So 30 to 60, that's where the majority of people that owned horses, because someone under 18 can't really technically own a horse. Their parents own it, right? So what they break it down like that. Now, I did say therapy earlier. That is becoming bigger and bigger around the world. In the United States, there's over 800 programs for therapeutic riding programs, hippotherapy. Here's some of the things that has really helped people mentally and physically. So substance abuse for both children and adults, psychosis, so mental problems, working with horses improves that. Mood, stress, obviously. I know horses can be stressful, but our mood, just when you're working with them, it's just something when you're around horses or you go for a ride or you work with them, it just helps alleviate stress and mood. Psychological disorders, developmental disorders, children's disorders, depression, domestic abuse. Many women and even men can be, go through domestic abuse. They improve, their outcomes and their mental health. And then post traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, soldiers coming back from war, getting involved with horse therapy has improved them. So that's been big in the United States. All right, let's look at a couple other places where I get some data. Canada, pretty similar. The demographics, when you looked at horse owners by age, 25 to 29, 10%, big jump up 30 to 39. That was close to 25%, then back down to over 10%. And so just across the board, very, very similar. Household income, again, very, very similar to what we said in the US, where you had under 30,000 here was 5% of horse owners in Canadian dollars. 14% made between 30 to 60,000 Canadian dollars. Then 25% for that 60 to 100,000 household income. And it just kind of goes up and then goes back down. So 200,000 or more was actually over 10%. So combined household income in Canadian dollars, but very, very similar to the US. And then when they asked them what they did, again, this was Equestrian Canada that put this out there. Most common roles in the equine sector are recreation, close to 70%. It was 69% participants. They recreational ride, amateur sport competition, another 60%, coaches, trainers, less than a quarter of them at 23%. Facility owner or operator was 15%. Farm or ranching was 12%. And it goes down. Breeder, 11%. Health practitioners, about 6% of people that participated in the equine industry. Then what do they primarily do? It's a quarter recreation, a quarter amateur sport, which is high. Close to 20% working animals, 15% breeding animals, and then the others. So it's huge. It's huge in Canada, right? It's huge in Australia, huge here in New Zealand. Obviously, a big driver in the United States. Still important in Europe. And so all in all, just looking at that, what the people are doing and who owns the horses, and it's not just the wealthy, it's everybody. It's all segments of society. It's all countries on earth. Um, Horses are still playing a key role in day-to-day life. So not only is it important to us as a companion, but important to us, our economies, and supporting our communities, and supporting the shop owners and the people that grow the hay, or all those other outside, the veterinarians we talked about, how critical they are, the farriers, the equine dentists, all of these people are supported by this industry. So be proud to be part of it, get involved with it, and understand that, the horse industry isn't going anywhere. When we look at the future in the next 100 years, we're still going to be riding horses. Next 1,000 years, we're still going to be riding horses. So, hug your little equid companion, thank them for everything they do for us, and just understand that, horses are a key part in the society of the worlds today. Thanks for watching.